Hereby, I open this academic ceremony in which Tamara Kool will defend the academic thesis Beyond the Right to Work, Labor Market Engagement and Protracted Refugees Through a Social Exclusion Lens. May I invite you to present the summary of your study and the conclusions of your thesis.
Thank you. Dear Pro-Rector, members of the Corona, supervisors, and family and friends, welcome to my public defense for the dissertation I've worked on over the past years, called Beyond the Right to Work, Labor Market Engagement of Protracted Refugees Through a Social Exclusion Lens. In this presentation, I want to briefly take you through my research. To date, the UNHCR reports we have over 26.5 million refugees. Many of those find themselves in a protected refugee situation with an average displacement of over 10 years. While under international refugee law, 3 durable solutions are foreseen, these solutions fall short in reality. Hence, the Global Compact on Refugees that was adopted in 2018 recognized the need for a new perspective. It proposes that as an alternative solution, refugees should achieve the appropriate economic, social, and cultural inclusion. But what does economic inclusion entail? Too often, we stop at refugees being able to participate on the labor market, but we fail to recognize the conditions under which refugees participate, as well as how policies shape their engagement. My thesis seeks to build on existing literature on economic participation of refugees by bringing in a social justice perspective. Employment is a key element to structurally integrate into society and to maintain a certain level of well-being. Regardless of their lack of status and the coinciding restrictions, refugees actively seek alternative ways to provide for their own livelihood and enter the labor market, formally or informally. But is this sufficient? From a rights-based perspective, all should have the right to work. I argue that we should go beyond this. Hence, I study the labor market engagement of protected refugees through the lens of social exclusion. Social exclusion should be understood as a process in which a group of people is marginalized from participating in social life. Taking an economic perspective, it can be argued that the labor market engagement of refugees consists of 2 stages, with the first stage being whether someone participates in the labor market, and the second stage accounting for the how. Non-inclusionary practices therefore correspond to the vulnerability of employment, precariousness of the labor market situation, and underemployment. On the one hand, this lens allows for an insight into between-group variation, so between refugees and members of the host community, as well as within-group variation by recognizing that some of the members within a specific group may be able to engage in an inclusive manner, whereas others do not. Multiple fault lines, which may reinforce each other, may be at stake in this exclusion process. In my thesis, I approach these by looking at the intersection between refugee-related policies and rights and the lived experiences of displaced persons. My thesis therefore sets out to address the following research question. To what extent are different protracted refugee groups in Jordan able to engage in the labor market in an inclusionary manner, and what role do refugee-related policies play in shaping this access? To answer this question, I address 4 different elements. Firstly, I assess the status and right to work of protracted refugees in Jordan. Next, I employ a mixed method approach combining both quantitative and qualitative methods. From a quantitative perspective, I seek to understand firstly the extent to which Syrian and Palestinian refugees respectively shape their labor market engagement, and secondly, the role of status and encampment policies on labor market outcomes. This analysis next informs my qualitative chapter, where I look at how agency of refugees intersects with policies and legislation. The Hashemite Kingdom of Jordan is a very relevant case study to look at. It is host to over 40 refugee nationalities and has a long tradition of refugee reception. The two biggest groups are the Palestinian refugees and Syrian refugees. The Palestinian refugees are characterized by different categorizations as a result of the Nakba in 1948 and the Six-Day War in 1967. More recently, since 2011, Jordan has also been host to Syrian refugees. Overall, Jordan is characterized by 4 distinct phases of refugee reception. Many of the Palestinian refugees from the Nakba in 1948 have received citizenship status, yet those primarily originating from Gaza continue to lack citizenship to date. In times, camps also started to emerge and more segregationist measures were put in place. Eventually, there was a clear demarcation of those who sought refuge in Jordan. Already from a historical perspective, we start to see a distinction in terms of status and camp residency that shapes the position of refugees in Jordan. But how is this related to the ability to engage on the labor market? And what is the right to work for refugees in Jordan? From an international law perspective, Jordan should provide refugees with the right to work equal to citizens. Yet, within the national legal framework, refugees without a national identity number are effectively classified as guests within the labor law and therefore subject to 4 main implications, namely the need to have a work permit, the closed profession list, which contains positions only open to Jordanian citizens, the dual minimum wage with non-Jordanians receiving a lower minimum wage than citizens, and lastly, restrictions on the establishment of home-based businesses. Taking into consideration the different layers of refugee-related policies, Chapter 4 sought to better understand the position of Palestinian refugees within the Jordanian labor market and which characteristics correspond to non-inclusionary labor market practices. It thus captures within-group differences. In the analysis, I sought to account for 3 different types of fault lines. Firstly, whether someone self-identifies as a Palestinian refugee. Secondly, the role of citizenship or non-inclusionary practices. And lastly, the role of camp residency. The findings suggest that despite the length of displacement, camps continue to correspond to a higher likelihood of being engaged in a non-inclusionary manner. Similarly, someone who does not have a national identity number, which is equal to citizenship status, tends to have a higher likelihood to be engaged in a non-inclusionary manner. Further, the findings are reflective of gendered effects, which by itself is not necessarily surprising, as Jordan also is characterized by one of the lowest female labor force participation rates in the world. Chapter 5 next builds on the previous chapter and seeks to better understand the between-group differences between refugees and Jordanian citizens. It captures the labor market engagement for respectively Syrian and Palestinian refugees and contrasts these to the host community. These findings showcase that refugees are generally more likely to engage in a non-inclusionary manner when compared to Jordanian citizens. At the same time, the coefficients for the Syrian refugees showcase a higher likelihood of being engaged in a non-inclusionary manner. This can be stated to be reflective of the short-term effect of displacement, with many accepting any form of work to counter the depletion of assets. Nonetheless, the findings are also cognizant of the long-lasting effects of displacement for Palestinian refugees. Similar to Chapter 4, it highlights the challenge of achieving inclusion in the long run if one does not hold citizenship status. Lastly, camp residency in and by itself corresponds to a higher likelihood of being engaged in a non-inclusionary manner. This is regardless of one's status. It needs to be recognized that camp residents may capture both citizens and non-citizens. This may be due to the longevity of camps, intermarriage, and the fact that also individuals who have received citizenship status continue to reside in camps boundaries. Therefore, When accounting for potential interaction between the status as refugees and camp residency, a ranking can be observed. This ranking suggests that camps may also have a positive effect on labor market engagement of refugees, something I further explore in my next chapter. My last empirical chapter thus builds on the legal chapter and the quantitative analysis. It seeks to connect both the policies and legislation with the lived experiences of refugees. In its analysis, it accounts for multiple levels where policies may intersect with the agency of refugees, namely on a macro, meso, and micro level. The analysis reaffirms the existing difference between factual rights and the actual practice. On the macro level, it should be noted that there is a danger in terms of how policies are framed. As a result of the Jordan Compact between the Jordanian government and the international community that was adopted in 2016, there has been an explicit focus on providing Syrian refugees with work permits. This had two main implications. Firstly, it coincided with additional policy measures. As a result, Palestinian refugees that lack a national identity number have reportedly faced increased restrictions as well. Secondly, this led to an increased risk of exploitation and insecurity of those who lack the skills for which work permits can be acquired, as the work permit scheme tends to focus on those in the low-skilled sector, such as agriculture, construction, and manufacturing. This illustrates the importance of assessing how policies also affect those that fall outside its focus or scope. In addition, on a meso level, the role of residency and community has been further explored. It highlights how policies differently affect those living in camp areas and those residing in urban and rural areas. It thus builds on the earlier findings that camps can also have a potential positive effect through the role of camp economy. Within a camp economy, it can be argued that a camp forms a market of its own, faced by its own challenges. This is regardless of the camp being an open or a closed structure. Both Syrian and Palestinian refugees reported a decline in market activities, whether as a result of rumors or economic struggles that Jordan was facing at the time. Similarly, those living in urban or rural areas may deliberately opt to live outside camp structures, as it provides opportunities not available in the camp area. Lastly, on a micro level, an intersectional lens should be taken. It highlights that the policies are not static, but rather affect individuals within refugee groups differently. Not only differences can be observed by where one resides or whether one belongs to the Syrian refugees or the Palestinian refugees, individual characteristics such as age, education, or gender may result in exclusionary practices, with not all members being included within the adopted policies in an equal manner. This brings me to the conclusion of today's presentation. My research has illustrated how we should go beyond whether someone participates in the labor market and instead look at the how and the role of refugee-related policies in shaping this engagement. Simply providing access to employment does not translate into the ability to engage in an inclusive manner. Therefore, to do justice to an individual's experience in the context of the labor market, a critical assessment is required on how policies and regulations, which often take a more universal or categorical approach, transform or may even negatively affect refugees' outcomes. Within this, the intersection between the different refugee-related policies, such as status, labor rights, and residency, should be taken into consideration. I'd like to end my presentation with a quote by Kafka, which highlights how laws and policies and the experience resulting from it is unique according to each individual. Everyone strives after the law, says the man. So how is it that in these many years, no one except me has requested entry? The gatekeeper sees that the man is already dying, and in order to reach his diminishing sense of hearing, he shouts at him, "Here, no one else can gain entry, since entrance was assigned only to you. I'm going now to close it. With this statement, I would like to end my presentation and return the word to the Pro-Rector.
Thank you for your presentation. The opposition will be opened by Professor Gusman, but I should mention upfront that we do have a member of the Rupee Committee online present, which will be Professor Zetta. You will hear him and see him later on. Regretfully, one member is absent, but Professor Gusman will also take care of the question that she sent in. It now gives me an opportunity to introduce Professor Gusman. She is a professor of social protection and development and was the chair of the assessment committee. The floor goes to Professor Gusman.
Thank you, Pro-Rector. Dear candidate, dear Tamara, congratulations are first in order for your thesis, which I really read with great interest, given we have spent some time together on a project in Jordan, so it was very enlightening to read it. I also think that your thesis is a wonderful example of the value of mixed method research, right? Where both qualitative and quantitative research and analysis are equally important in answering your overall guiding research question. So your thesis is about the inclusion of refugees in the labor markets, for example, of the host countries. And I was also thinking, I mean, maybe even more now when the final book was here and I was preparing actually for this defense, that even though the research took place in Jordan, the topic is extremely relevant, also for us here in the Netherlands. And it is particularly interesting to see the difference in inclusion of, let's say, the Syrian versus the Ukrainian refugees in the country. I'm not going to talk about that. My question is about your theoretical framework, which you outline and describe in chapter 2. And your conceptual framework, it derives from 3 theories. We have labor market theory, refugee economy, and social exclusion theory. And essentially, the refugee economy and the social exclusion are the main underlying theories guiding your analysis. But the question is how or to what extent are these 3 theoretical approaches complementary or even substitutionary? So for example, just as an example, how does social exclusion theory in the context of refugee actually differ from the concept of refugee economies? So I would like you, to elaborate and enlighten us with your thinking about how these 3 theories relate, where they complement each other, or maybe can we just drop one even?
Dear highly esteemed Professor, thank you so much for the kind words, but also, of course, for the challenging question. I kind of expected a very challenging question from you. It's a very good question. It's also a bit of a complicated question in the sense that you're absolutely right. There is a lot of overlap between the different branches of literature. And that's also why in a way, I've been struggling on how do I write it up? To what extent do we see the connection between and where are they separate in that sense? Now, when it comes to the labor market theory, the refugee economies and the social exclusion, from a labor market perspective, they often tend to look at, okay, how do they participate? What's the effect of social capital, for example, on the ability to participate in the labor market or the wage inequality? My argument is that we need to go beyond the wage inequality. We need to go, and while I fully recognize also the social network, the role of social network, and I try to integrate that to the extent possible, it should not end at where does this influence whether someone participates. We know that often when you're faced with depletion of resources, with how can you put that, the fickleness of the humanitarian aid sector, they tend to find their way to the labor market because they need to be able to provide for the family and to ensure that at least there's a sufficient level of well-being. So this is where, in part, the refugee economies come in. And we saw that at first Karen Jacobsen particularly contributed to this discussion, and then with Werke 2007 was influential in the sense of recognizing the role of the camp economy. And then more recently, we have, by the Refugee Studies Center, the entire development of the refugee economies aside. And it recognizes that, yes, we have three different layers. We have the global layer, we have the connection to the markets around it on the national level, and we have the communal levels. And these are important, but they, again, in my view, fall short in the sense that they do not necessarily look at the conditions under which one engages. They also primarily take a market perspective, and they seek to more approach it from as a result of entrepreneurship or just different jobs, and just give them. And in a way, this is interesting, this is very relevant, but I feel that we don't do justice then to how people participate. And this is where also the social exclusion then comes in the sense that the social exclusion recognizes that, firstly, yes, we have both the refugee groups and members of the host community. So you have the element of between group differences, but you also have the element of within group. And some are due to their social capital, due to the network or prior connections or financial assets, are able to participate in an equal manner, but others do not. And then the question is, why do they not participate? And for this, I think we need to dig much deeper. And that's why I argue, okay, we need to look at both overt and covert processes that influence their outcome, as also social exclusion seeks to do. And this is what you then see captured through the policy. So it places much more recognitions on that you have different policies, and that there is actually not one policy that captures it all, but we need to also recognize the interaction between the policies. I hope with that I have addressed the question to an extent.
Thank you.
Thank you. The opposition will be continued by Dr. Van Nora, who was also a member of the assessment committee. And Dr. Van Nora is a research fellow at UNU Merit at this university. The floor goes to Dr. Van Nora.
Thank you very much. Dear candidate, dear Tamara, it is really with great excitement that we can all be together here for this event. I think I won't repeat what our colleague has already said, but I would like for you to appreciate how hefty this book is. I think that there is as much information in the appendices and annexes as there actually is in the main chapters. But this is not a critique. I find it quite joyous. What I really enjoyed about reading your text is realizing how many different disciplines you integrated into this piece. It's not just a matter of multiple methods, but it's really having different lenses, different frames that you approach it from. I think you've at times taken the hat of an historian, of a legal expert, of an economist, of an anthropologist, and I really want for you to appreciate these different lenses that you've taken and what a strong piece they eventually cultivated. But of course, I think you probably see where this is going. When you integrate these different disciplines and lenses, inevitably you're going to get a question about how they intersect. I was thinking very hard about the type of conclusions that you draw in your thesis. And of course, you study different refugee populations that are embedded in a context that is, let's say, highly structured within hierarchies of inclusion and exclusion. We're not only talking about differences between refugees and non-refugees, but it's also internal hierarchies. And I think this is in some way already implied in taking the social inclusion and social justice lens, is that you are focusing, of course, on relative differences, on observing both horizontal and vertical inequalities. This element of vertical inequality within the Jordanian population hasn't really been brought to the fore in your thesis. And in a sense, it was surprising for me thinking about who your reference population is. In speaking about the mechanisms, let's say, of exclusion and let's say, division of labor and the non-inclusionary labor practices that you see in Jordan, It strikes me that many of these mechanisms are true for non-refugee populations. And in part, it has to do with, again, these hierarchies of inclusion and exclusion that are not only about legal membership, but are also about political membership, about sociocultural membership, and so on. I see as well that in this context, there are very highly gendered hierarchies, and sometimes ethnic or national hierarchies that even are true within the Jordanian population. So if I think about this gendered, racialized inclusion-exclusion element within the Jordanian context, how distinct are refugees really? Are the processes or are the kind of non-inclusionary labor practices that they face really refugee distinct, especially when you exclude the legal category, their legal basis of mobility? So I guess if you're especially embarking from a point of intersectional vulnerability, what is distinct to the refugee experience? I think this is a first more conceptual question, and then the second one is more practical, probably also easier to answer. What are the empirical implications if you were to actually disaggregate the Jordanian reference population? So let's say, for example, that you are to compare female refugees to female Jordanians. Would the mechanisms of non-inclusionary practices be so different?
Thank you, dear esteemed opponent. Thank you very much for your kind words and also your question. And just to make sure, because sorry, I was writing along as you were saying, and I just want to make sure that I address your question sufficiently. In the first question, you're asking about the conceptual framework framing of the gendered racial hierarchies. Is that correct?
Correct. And whether those hierarchies are, let's say, going to have the same origins for the Jordanian population as for the refugee population. So really, how different are refugees when you take it from the intersectional vulnerability lens?
Okay, great. Thank you for the clarification. So with regards to the very first point, from a conceptual perspective, when we look at the context of the Middle East, and particularly the context of Jordan, yes, there is a very gendered nuance that we need to take into consideration. Already Jordan itself, it really depends what layer of society you are from, to what extent you can also participate or are engaging in the labor market. Let me put it that way. There are highly social elements that come into play. Now, this puts you already from a citizenship perspective, in a way, in a secondary position. Now, the challenge where that comes in for the refugees and where it gets actually more complicated is that this is an additional layer that is put on top of already this marginalization, in the sense that if you want to, for example, establish a home-based business, as a Jordanian woman, sure, you will face some restrictions. You need a certain level of funding, but this is easier. For a Syrian refugee woman, at the time of the research, you needed to have a Jordanian partner. You needed to have over 10,000, I don't remember the exact amount, to forgive me, but a very high amount of Jordanian dinars to be able to even set up a home-based business. And while both Syrian and Jordanian women in that sense, of course, due to the societal cultural perspective, are more likely to engage in do work from their homes. And this is also something that was actively promoted by many of the NGOs. The ability to even set it up from the legal perspective, that's where it then gets additionally complicated. So if we talk about it, it's really then a dual marginalization that you face as such. So yes, gender in itself is something that you need to consider when we talk about labor market engagement. But for women of a refugee group that don't hold citizenship status, the challenge becomes more complicated. And we see that most of, even for the Palestinian refugees, particularly those from ex-Gaza, we see that there is this tendency also that women preferably stay within the context of the camp environment. And it doesn't matter if that's even an open camp environment. I think I may have referred to also have a quote somewhere in my thesis, but one of the interviews that I did, for example, was in the Al Hussein camp in Amman. And there also it was indicated that if you would set up a factory inside a camp, then we can convince our husbands to work here. They were living like literally 50 meters away from Udon Street, which is effectively where then the city of Amman already is. So it gives, and it's an open structure, unlike Zaatari camp. And a similar notion was actually also mentioned in Zaatari camp, where they said, okay, maybe if we have the factories inside, it would be easier. But the fact that even if we can get the work permit for the manufacturing, we have to leave very early and then come back. This takes away too much time from the home. So it requires a more nuanced understanding of, okay, what are the types of positions that they're able to engage in? How does this also coincide with their additional role as a woman? And what are the additional restrictions that you face as a result of living in certain areas or as a result of the legal restrictions that are in place? I don't know if with that, I also think I partly addressed your second question already to an extent as well, if I'm not mistaken.
Agreed.
Right?
And in view of time, I think it's a good idea to rotate, but thank you.
Sorry.
Thank you. The opposition will be continued by Professor Zetta. Professor Zetta was the third member of the assessment committee, and he's an emerite professor of refugee studies and the retiring director of Oxford University's Refugee Studies Center. And he will be addressing you online, as you can see.
Yeah.
Thank you very much, Chair, and hello, Tamara. I'm really sorry that I can't be there to share this rite of passage in person with you, but I certainly want to join my two colleagues who presented so far from the Assessment Committee in first of all commending the work that you've done, the research that you've done, both the mixed methods, the quantitative, qualitative methods. I think that sheds important new light on many of the dimensions of refugee access to labour markets, but also the multidisciplinary approach that you've adopted as well. A lot of my own research has been trying to establish a multidisciplinary lens, and I recognise the challenges that you faced and which the previous member of the Assessment Committee was challenging you about. So thank you very much indeed, I think, for an extremely stimulating thesis, and also I think this morning a very, very clear presentation as well. I think you managed to capture the essence of the thesis in, as I say, a very articulate and a very clear presentation. So thank you for that. I suppose from my point of view, it's very interesting to see the way the whole debate and discourse about the right to work and labour market access for refugees has evolved over the last 7 or 8 years. As you know, and you cite quite frequently the study I did with my colleague Eloise Rouadel for the World Bank on refugees' right to work, and then a lot of work subsequently for the ILO. And it's very interesting, I think, to see the way in which research like yours starts to, well, not starts, but continues to ask these fundamental questions about what this right actually means and how utilitarian and functionalist approaches that governments and international organizations adopt actually play out with respect to the capacity, the agency, the wishes, the aspirations of refugees themselves. So I think your work has taken that thinking, that understanding on quite significantly. The question, not surprisingly, I've got quite a lot of questions, but I will limit it to one to start with. Your work and the presentation this morning focused very much on the policy environment, the legal environment, the governance conditions that regulate and limit refugees' access to labour markets. But you also mentioned very briefly in passing in your presentation that one of the constraints to labour market access is the precariousness of the labour market itself. Now, your thesis focuses very much on the kind of demand side, the demand that refugees have to work and how that is mediated by law, by policy, and so on. But I think the other side of the equation is very much the supply side. What is the nature of the labour market itself in a country like Jordan? Because all the countries that host large populations of refugees essentially have quite precarious, quite narrowly defined labour markets. Now, of course, that could be a different, and it is a different PhD thesis, but I'd very much like you to elaborate a little bit more on this other side of the equation, how the constraints of the labour market itself act as a limit to accessibility, as a limit to social inclusion of refugees.
Dear highly esteemed Professor, first of all, I would like to thank you for joining us online. I'm sorry you can't be here in person, but I'm very happy to have you join online. And thank you very much for your kind words and also provoking question. I think this is a very relevant point and also a very complicated point to answer that slightly goes beyond the thesis as you indicated, but nonetheless, it has a role to play. Now, when we look at Jordan, we first of all need to recognize that there is a highly informal economy on the basis of data from 2010. It was already estimated back then that over 40% of the Jordanian economy is informal in nature. And this has reportedly grown to over 50% since the Syrian influx. In addition, we know that Jordan has been facing economic challenges as a result of the larger economic climate, which has led to inflation. It has led to challenges on how to deal with the fiscal space and the debt and whether additional tax should be put in place on people, which has an effect again on, of course, also the ability to have a shop or to have a business. It was reported, amongst others, by certain refugees that, you know, they had to close the shop, that the labor market had declined within the campsites because they just simply couldn't afford the prices for the gas, water, and electricity anymore. So these already put restraints, but at the same time, it can be argued, and I think this is also a complicated issue, and of course, a not very popular opinion, but that the informal economy also provides opportunities because it offers individuals with the ability to find jobs, even if it's temporary in nature, and to move from a position to a position, at least to ensure that, you know, they have a source of income. That said, of course, that means that also the formal opportunities are much less. But while we look at Jordan, we know that Jordan in itself has a highly educated population, with many that leave the university not being able to find employment and face unemployment afterwards due to the limitations of the private sector. So that, but those opportunities are not even available to the refugees because those would be job positions that are either on the closed profession list or are require association with the professional or registration with the professional associations, which is not open and or only in certain circumstances to non-Jordanians. So taking those elements into consideration, for sure, the macro economy, the supply side faces its own sets of challenges, and it particularly has affected those in the informal sectors as a result of the COVID. Nonetheless, because of the nature of the informal sector, it also provides those with an opportunity to maneuver or regain access to the labor market. I don't know if that addresses your question to an extent, but I hope so.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
Thank you. The opposition will be continued by Professor Dr. de Neuboer, Professor Nadura is an Emerite Professor of Public Policy Analysis and Management at the TS School for Business and Society at Tilburg University. The floor goes to Professor Nadura.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you, Pro-Rector. Dear candidate, Tamara, it's with great, I read your work later because I was not part of the assessment committee. And it was with great interest that I started to read and found it very interesting and also very linked to the work that we have done in the region as well. Still, I have questions, and I would like you to address the questions. Let me put the gender question that I also had in a very simple form where you can answer yes or no, and then I'm sure that other colleagues will have more elaborate questions on that. Did you estimate the tables for 5, 5 to 5, 7 separately for men and women? And if you did, I'm curious about the results. Because I intuitively, I think the results would be very different for men and women. But if you didn't, then the answer is simply no, and then you don't have to elaborate on that. So that's very, very quick. The other thing is that we did most of my experience there in the region is mostly within Palestine. And we found in Palestine, we discussed the same issues as you discussed. We found individual characteristics of the Palestinian people in SOP, in the state of Palestine, very important in explaining their degree of labor market inclusion or exclusion. And I find very few of these variables in your estimations or in your discussions in chapter 6. I know that, of course, you're limited to the data. I know the FAFO data myself quite well, so I know your limitations, but I still would like you to reflect on what you think and what your, especially your qualitative research told you about how important these things are. There are a couple of things in your thesis, in your own estimates that already point to that. And I'm especially pointing to the results for Jeddah. That seems to be different from the rest, which is not completely surprising because they're so close to Gaza. We found in our research that violence, exposure to violence was an important factor in how people could work in the labor market because it had to do with PTSD and all kind of trauma, other type of trauma. So I would like to see whether your qualitative research added to this in this kind of research, in this kind of direction. Finally, I would like to invite you to do more research on this. And I think it would be very interesting to look at the Palestinian refugees and the Palestinians in Palestine, in Israel, and of course in Jordan and in the other countries. It would be very interesting to compare their level of inclusion. Although I could also see some empirical problems in the database there.
Dear highly esteemed professor, many thanks for your words and for your questions. Firstly, with regards to the gender, my answer is very simple, no. I'm happy to elaborate at a later stage, but my simple answer would be no. But let me go into the second question that you asked, which relates to, okay, the role of individual characteristics, the exposure to violence, etc. Now, with regards to individual characteristics, this is also why I argue, okay, you know, to an extent you need to account for an intersectional lens. To take an example, when I was talking in Zatari camp and I was talking with multiple women, of course, it's on the one hand the household environment, but it's also more complex. It depended on whether a woman was able to work already or had prior work experience in Syria, and that influenced to an extent also their desire to engage in the labor market. And often these were also more educated women. But at the same time, it does not necessarily mean that if you're highly educated that you wish to engage on the labor market or that it's desired by the male members of the family, because I had a very interesting encounter where I was quite literally told we prefer our women to be highly educated, but then we would like them to stay at home. So there are multiple levels that come into play. Similarly, the age structure needs to be taken into consideration. So if you wanted to work, for example, in a formal manner, if you wanted to access the work permit schemes, then there were certain sectors available, agriculture, but then you had to leave often informally to also go in the fields nearby. And that was more on a daily basis. But also the other option was, for example, manufacturing. But then with manufacturing, these were located in qualified industrial zones. The qualified industrial zones were located rather far from the camp. So to be able to go to those zones, you would need to leave at 6 o'clock. Now, firstly, the borders of the camp or the police station of the camp was not open at the time, so you could not leave formally through the police. And secondly, this would take too much time away because those often also had the characteristics that you needed between up to the age of 35. That was often used as a cutoff point in many of the vacancies. And even though older women would like to work, they're not considered for those positions. And then the women that are considered for those positions, they either have to live away from the family, which is not desirable because you have the caretaking role, but also they are the ones that often had children between the age of 20 and 35. So already there we see how individual characteristics shape their outcomes in a way. Similarly, you asked about the exposure to violence. Now, with regards to the exposure to violence, this did not come up so much within my own research. Part of the challenge from this was, firstly, I did not ask specific questions, and unless they would raise it, I would not probe into it for also ensuring that my participants are at ease. And within the camp, I was accompanied, as you could read in chapter 7, I was accompanied by an UNHCR official. And I was already told that I was particularly not asked to ask about the future in general, but I always had to make sure to connect it back to the labor market because of sensitivity of issues, and they did not want certain topics to be addressed. So I had to play it a bit more on the side. Nonetheless, I do believe that this was also my best option in terms of being able to participate or engage in research in the camp area. Now, when asked, I did inquire if, for example, they had heard of practices or encountered practices in terms of participation outside camp areas. One of the things that did emerge is that they said, well, yes, I don't want to work outside the camp if they had a business inside the camp or something else, because there is violence, there's exploitation, etc. Yet often when you probe further, they didn't experience themselves. So that also creates these challenges. So it's a lot of hearsay, but I don't necessarily have it substantiated. And then lastly, with regards to the question on the Palestinian-Israel, Lebanon, Jordan, and Syria, I mean, this is a very interesting question. Definitely leads to additional complications because the position of Palestinians already, it differs very much on whether you're from Syria, whether you live in Lebanon, whether you're in Jordan or in Palestine, of course. There are different legal restrictions and legal statuses in a way. So it would be very relevant. The complication would be, okay, how can you compare between the two? But I definitely think that it's worth further researching.
Thank you. The opposition will be continued by Dr. Ragat, who is a transcultural researcher and consultant. The floor is yours, Dr. Ragat.
Dear candidate, dear Tamara, congratulations also from my side on this very interesting book and all the accomplishments along the way. I really always enjoyed the discussions we had, and I was really, I enjoyed the reading and the final piece of it, which brought it all together. And I really can just add to my colleagues before that I was impressed not only by the mixed method approach, which I think really shows the complexity of refugee experience, but also the different disciplines you made use of. And also, I feel you introduced a lot of topics where I would also love to dig deeper into. Because as also Michaela said, on the one hand, it gives richness to your analysis, but sometimes you maybe lack the deepness of discussion. But one finding which I really also found interesting is the intersection of the institutional framework, social relation, and policy responses, and how these actually reproduce dynamic constructs of citizenship and rights. So I really appreciate this argument that rights and citizenship is flexible, and resides also in different positions of inclusion and exclusion. You also mentioned, I will touch upon again, the gendered experience more in depth, because in the qualitative chapter, you also argue for a more intersectional approach, which takes into account the different characteristics. You also argue that we should move beyond seeing gender as biological sex. But I was missing sometimes a bit from an intersectional perspective, not adding different characteristics of individuals, but also understanding the social processes and power dynamics and hierarchies which produce these kind of positions. So I was wondering also, based on your findings, could you name and identify these hierarchies a bit more better? I think you touched upon also a bit. And you also argued for further studies which should focus on women and specifically refugee women and the labor market participation. But how would you design a study for maybe inspiration for further work?
Dear esteemed opponent, many thanks for your words and also for the challenging question again. Let me think, yeah, you're absolutely right. I think, building on different disciplines, it is challenging sometimes to go a bit more in depth, and you think, oh, I should research this further, I should look at that further. And the thing is that, of course, you take a certain perspective and you have to make choices along the way. Nonetheless, if I would think about, okay, if I would do a next study where I would look at labor market engagement and I would look at the position of refugee women, what are considerations that we should take into consideration, that we should include? And I think one of the challenges is here that firstly, we need to recognize that sometimes not every woman wants to work on the labor market, but at the same time, they are primarily targeted by the international sector because there's often this focus on let's focus on empowerment. But this also brings into play the following, the word power. And what does power really mean? And that's already where we see a certain balance and a certain trade-off emerging, because you can have power over, but you want to also create power to the women and power within the women. And I think from this perspective, you need to understand, okay, what are then the elements? What is, first of all, the motivation? What are the drivers? How do they view their own participation? How do they view participation of the members of the household? Do they believe that maybe their youth should work, as one of the women also highlighted? Where do they see themselves work? What is it that they actually require in terms of support? If I would ideally have all the money in the world and set up my own research in that sense, I would actually start first by asking these type of questions before I actually, to ensure that I can take their perspective into consideration before I then go into the next stages of really going in depth in terms of survey, as well as in terms of focus group, additional interviews where you explore the situation of women more in depth. So I think, yeah, from an ideal perspective, and if you take more, well, critical feminist lens, then you should include their perspective within the design process and then build on that and set up the own research and not have it fully influenced by my outside perspective.
Thank you.
Okay, thank you. The opposition will be continued once again by Professor Gusman, but then she will have the floor because she's been contacted by Professor Dat, who is the director of the Center for Strategic Studies of the University of Jordan. But Professor Gusman will read or will present her issue.
I will just read what he has actually. He wishes you a lot of good luck. He submitted 2 questions, but I made a selection. So how would you, dear candidate, how would you reconcile the findings of your case study, Jordan, a country with limited resources and thorough economic situation, with the response of higher income host countries? So in terms of including refugees in the labor market and shaping the narrative of intergroup integration. And I think that goes back to my very first comment that I actually made with maybe the lessons learned for us here in the Netherlands.
Dear highly esteemed professor, many thanks for asking the question on Professor Eyadat's behalf. And yes, I see the interlinkage to the very first point that you mentioned. I think it's a challenging issue, of course, because on the one hand, yes, he rightfully points out that we're dealing with a resource-constrained country context. We're also dealing with a very different legal framework in that sense. While refugees are non-citizens here in the Netherlands until they have received citizenship status, at least there is the potential within time to achieve citizenship status, for example, in the Netherlands. And also within a certain time frame, access is provided to both social security as well as to the labor markets. And this is defined by the law, if I'm not mistaken. So that leads to a very, from a legal perspective, in a way, a different context. Nonetheless, what we do want to take into considerations are also the political pressures in a way that the refugee population are facing, and also how the debate on the national level influences how we also treat refugees. You were mentioning, for example, earlier already, the difference in how we accept Ukrainian refugees today compared to, for example, the Syrian refugees, where with many restrictions in a way being or bureaucratic hurdles being lifted. And that's something that we should take into consideration, because the way that the Ukrainian discourse, at least from my perspective, if I look at the news, is framed in a way is that they're deemed closer to us, which I don't fully like. Yeah, I find that a very challenging statement where I think any human being should be equal from an international law perspective and should be treated equally in a country. But because we have a different perspective on how the Ukrainians refugees, this also influenced their outcomes. And this brings in the interplay between the institutional framework and the policy process, as was also pointed out by Nora earlier. Namely, the rights in a way are not static. They are determined by dynamics. And I think that's also the takeaway when you would replicate such a study within a European context, is that you want to look at also the different discourses that are ongoing in society and how this also affects the regulations and the rules that are applied to refugees. I hope that addresses the questions to an extent. It's a challenging one.
Was there any follow-up question from your side? In that case, we only have 1 or 2 minutes more, so I'm happy to give the floor to Professor Zetta because he's furthest away. But if just in case you would have, say, a 1-minute question, something like this, Professor Zetta. You're muted, please.
Yes, that's quite a challenge, Chair. I will ask the question, but I guess we might be sort of cut off because of time, Tamara. In your penultimate slide in your presentation, before the Franz Kafka quote, and also on page 208 of your thesis, you are somewhat critical of what you call a lack of a uniform approach to protracted refugees. Now, it seems to me that your thesis, in fact, is the counter to that, that in a sense, we don't need a universalistic, a uniform approach to protracted refugees, but local conditions, local capacities, the agency of different ethnic groups, different nationalities of refugees is what seems to be critical to labour market access, not some kind of universalistic categorization of the protracted refugee. So there's a kind of tension in your thesis. In about 30 seconds, how would you resolve that tension?
Dear highly esteemed professor, thank you for the interesting question in a way. I think when it comes to the protected refugees, we need to account as well that, you have.
As much as the hour has passed, you can briefly conclude your response, please.
Okay, I'll try to be very brief in this case. But I think the categorization of the protected refugee situation, we talk about the protected refugee situation just for the members of the audience as well. In case a group of 25,000 individuals from the same nationality arrives in a specific host country and stay there for a period of 5 years or longer. Now, in a way, this is a uniform definition. At the same time, we need to account for the nationalities, as you pointed out. We need to account for the background where they're located, because dependent on where they are, their outcomes will differ, and dependent on where they originate from, their outcomes will also have different, or the way that their agency is shaped and the way that they participate is also different, because policies also change over time. And I'm now just rumbling, I feel, so I will stop it here if that is okay, but happy to continue the discussion at a later stage.
Thank you. Tamara Kool, the time appointed for defending your thesis has passed, and the degree committee will now withdraw to discuss the quality of your thesis and the quality of your defense. And I request that you and your company await the results of our deliberations and our return in this room.
I think I read for the first time a presentation today. Normally I don't do it, but I was like, I want to have it perfect. Yeah.
Tamara, the degree committee here present has assessed the quality of your thesis and the quality of your defense. And in view of its positive verdict and taking into account your previous qualifications, the degree committee has decided to grant you the degree of doctor. And it's Professor Koza who is authorized to confer upon you this academic distinction in accordance with Dutch university custom. And I invite your supervisor to now take the floor.
Congratulations, Tamara. Do you promise to work in accordance with the principles of scientific integrity at all times? To be careful and honest, transparent, independent, and responsible?
I do.
By the authority vested in us by law and in conformity with the decision of the committee here present, I hereby confer upon you, Tamara Antoinette Kool, the degree of doctor, and grant you all rights attached by custom and law. As evidence of this, I now present you with the degree certificate signed by the rector, the secretary, and the other members of the committee, and affixed with the official seal of the university.
Oh, I think Herman wanted to take a photo. Sorry.
The laudatio will be by Dr. Zina Nine.
Is it? I don't know if you realize, but a huge storm just completely. So that's a good sign. Ja, ik zou willen beginnen met een paar woorden in het Nederlands. Speciaal voor de ouders en familie van Tamara, van Dr. Kool. Jullie ook gefeliciteerd namens haar supervisieteam. Het was fantastisch om met Tamara samen te werken. Ze is een geweldig mens die ons vandaag erg trots gemaakt. Gefeliciteerd. Dear Tamara, dear Dr. Kool, nice ring to it. You made it. I told you so. So did Khalid. So did Lutz. We always knew we would be standing here, and today we celebrate all your hard work. So on behalf of the three of us, it has been a true pleasure being on this journey with you. The first person that Tamara in our team met was Lutz. She was part of the very first cohort of the MPP who received the double degree back in 2014. If you recall, within the first 2 weeks of the MPP, you had reached out to him with a question regarding the very first paper, which was meant to be a simple discussion of how a particular social issue can be placed on a policy agenda. And here I quote Lutz. Tamara is, to this date, the only student to reach out to me with a question that hidden with it an already completed analysis. She had a topic, had identified an unusual configuration of actors, declared it an interesting edge case, was checking that it is still well within her paper, and it was. I met you when I was pregnant with my second child, with whom you share a birthday with. when you joined social protection. But I could only stay for one period as I had to go on maternity leave. And I saw you again. We met at a gathering at La Place for the social protection students at the V&D. And she took some pictures, which I recalled recently. So we're talking now 2014. And I said, Tamara, do you remember these photos? A couple of hours later, they were in my inbox. Now, I asked Khalid to tell me when was the first time he met. And he said, I can't quite remember. And I would normally make it up, but I know Tamara would have very clear memory of this, so I would not even dare. So you came a tiny bit later on that journey. And we have you, Tamara, to thank, because we also had a lot of fun being on your team and for bringing us together, which was really enjoyable. We had very good conversations, discussions. They always went smoothly. I don't think we even disagreed. Of course, the last year of wrapping the thesis and finalizing it, Tamara would present everything in remarkable detail with little room for improvement, followed by comments from me and Lutz and Khalid with variations. Sure, it's good. Sure, you're good. Seriously, you can do it. Just go easy on yourself. From the time where you were a student at the MPP, your analytical mind and tendency to plan your work very well meant that you usually turned in excellent work. Lutz informed me that you actually had an 8 for econometrics and public policy, which was a hard feat. And you actually never showed that you were struggling with it. And you soon started investigating something else that you wanted to do. And here, according to Lutz again, he calls it the quadruple workload. Not content with just doing the specialization, participating in a competition launched by Bart Verspagen to develop an ODA awareness campaign, won it and led her team to design and evaluate the campaign, signed up for a master's honors premium program, and was selected and worked on ethnic violence, and completed your master thesis with a grade above an 8. So while at the university, it's not unusual to be approached by young, talented, and determined people who clearly mapped out plans within 3 levels of color coding, the level by which Tamara was operating was special. And when you showed up a year or so after graduation to join the PhD program, that was really a very good decision. Tamara's PhD journey was a combination of happy moments and, as they say in Dutch, bloed, zweet en tranen, including a pandemic that created difficult working conditions to most. But I am so glad we are here and celebrating it in person. Maybe that's the sign of the crazy storm outside. She chose Jordan as her case study and came to me, who back then I had made a very strong decision. I am not going to work on Jordan anymore. I'm not going to work on the Middle East. I still joke till this day to tell Tamara she's the one who made me go back and do policy work in the Middle East. The PhD wasn't just an academic project for Tamara. She got so much into it, into learning the culture, trying to understand the language, learning about things that actually sometimes I was wondering who was more Jordanian. Jordan is a very particular country. From the outside, it looks easy and approachable. Yet once you get into the depth of it, you find it very multi-layered and complex, and it's not easy. And that would be frustrating at times, but you strived, whether it was waiting on data, collecting data, trying to understand the laws, the culture, meeting government officials, field work, local academics. You were always patient, extremely respectful, extremely culturally appropriate and appreciative. I also remember we always enjoyed falafel meals in Amman. And she is actually the one who introduced me to all the falafel and Middle Eastern shops in Maastricht. And she made sure to take me and try them a couple of weeks ago. Your work has provided in-depth understanding of the dynamics of the labor market participation as we saw today, and it will be a very important contribution to the ongoing debate on this topic. You did it with a lot of dedication, truthfulness, and attention to detail. And yes, it needed a very strong push from Francisca at the end, who we are so grateful for, and who was instrumental in literally clearing up your calendar so you can submit. Thank you, Francisca. Working with Tamara has been very colorful. She has so much enthusiasm and a strong sense of independence. Weaved with a strong sense of team. There we go. She has a generous nature, very industrious, and loves planning. We could actually have very full conversation about bullet journals, organization apps, and notebook types. Tamara, I think you're the only person whom I feel understands very well how planning is my favorite form of procrastination. I can always count on her, whether in a project that we were doing together, a paper, or giving feedback over an idea, or teaching and interacting with students, which is another thing that I would like to mention about Tamara. Students love her. I looked up evaluations from previous SP courses where you tutored. They were all excellent and high marks, but I would like to quote one of the students who said, "I want to thank Tamara, who always went the extra miles." And that is Tamara. Sometimes she goes the extra miles, even though she has 100 other deadlines that she has to do, but because she feels it is important to do. And while sometimes things do get overwhelming and she feels she can't finish what she started, I want to say that today is an example that you can finish what you start. Sometimes with a bit of a delay, but you will always get there. And when I look back at the period between 2003 and see who you have become today, I must say, if I may, that I'm very proud and to have worked with you, and also on behalf of my colleagues. And you should be very proud of yourself. And here I would like to conclude and take the occasion in a sense of tradition with a small poem, and I hope you take its words with you to the next phase of your career, and it's called Believe in Yourself. Dear Tamara, believe in yourself, in the power you have to control your own life day by day. Believe in the strength that you have deep inside you, and your faith will help show you the way. Believe in tomorrow and what it will bring. Let a hopeful heart carry you through, for things will work out. If you trust and believe, there is no limit to what you can do. It has been a pleasure being your supervisor all these years, and on behalf of Khalid and Lutz, I wish you success in the future. Gefeliciteerd.
Dear Dr. Kool, also on behalf of the Board of Deans, I congratulate you, your family and friends, and your supervisors with the honor you have acquired. I'd like to thank the members of the degree committee, and I would like to give Professor Zetta an opportunity to congratulate you, because I know that he'll be eager to do so. So we'll give him 1 or 2 minutes, Professor Zetta, and then we will proceed here further.
Thank you very much, Chair, and congratulations, Dr. Tamara Kool. It was, as I said in my introduction to my comments, I found your work extremely stimulating. I liked the way that your works were fitted into this ongoing trajectory of a fundamental question many of us have been concerned with, about the rights of access that refugees have to many aspects of their lives in displacement, including economic opportunities and labour market access in particular. And I think what I found particularly interesting is the presentation by your supervisor just now, describing your personality, your commitment to the field, the integrity of your work, and in many ways your extreme commitment, not just to research because of the value of research, but your extreme commitment, I think, to the lives of refugees, the interests of refugees, which at the end of the day is what motivates all of us who are involved in this field, which is of profound European and global significance, as we know only too well. So I commend you very much on your work. I wish you, I'm sure my colleagues on the assessment committee will join me in wishing you all the best for your future work. It seems that you already have employment established to continue the kind of research that you've been doing. And I'm only sorry that I can't be there to share this moment with you, but I hope that someday our paths might cross face to face. So my very best wishes to you, and I'm sure that your career as it develops as an academic and as a researcher will be as fulfilling and as valuable as your work has obviously been so far in the progress to your doctoral your doctoral award. Congratulations.
Thank you once again. Congratulations once again also from our side. Before closing this session, I would like to say that we apparently pictures will be taken here, both in the aula and then later on these larger stairs, etc. Those in the audience who might best spend your time waiting by already having a drink in the rafter. So you walk in a kind of, if you walk out and then go to your right, and that's where they will serve the drinks, and then all the merrier. You can congratulate Dr. Kool a few minutes later. I close this session.
Thank you so much.